He was a man of God, a husband, and a healer, until the mask slipped. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a death sentence. When we look to the pulpit, we expect peace, wisdom, guidance. We don't expect secrets. We don't expect lies. And we certainly don't expect blood. But sometimes, the most righteous smile hides the darkest heart. What happens when the man who blesses your union is the one who ends it? When the one trusted to counsel, to comfort, to serve, is the very one who sets a plan into motion that burns everything down, literally. This isn't a tale of suspicion. It's a tale of sin, unholy, calculated, and cold. And before we reveal the chilling unraveling of a family, the web of deceit spun in silence, and the twisted motivations behind an unimaginable crime, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Because this is the kind of story that doesn't just shock, it stays with you. To the thousands who packed the pews of Divine River Tabernacle every Sunday, Pastor Leontae Durell Whitlow was more than a preacher. He was a revelation. He didn't just speak the word, he made it thunder. Born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, Leontae was the son of a steelworker and a church secretary. His mother used to say God marked him even in the womb. By the age of 10, he was reciting scripture from memory. By 16, he was preaching at youth revivals. And by 25, he had founded Divine River in the heart of Atlanta, a city already crowded with churches, but somehow missing what he called fire-fed faith. Leontae brought that fire. He wasn't just a preacher, he was a movement. His gospel-healing revivals drew crowds so large they spilled into the streets. His Instagram, a digital pulpit in itself, boasted over 120,000 followers, many of whom tuned in religiously for his midweek Manna Live sessions. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove a white Escalade with tinted windows, and carried an air of spiritual authority that made grown men cry at the altar. He was invited to mega-conferences, appeared on religious talk shows, and even had whispers of a book deal on the horizon. In the eyes of many, Leontae Durell Whitlow wasn't just favored, he was chosen. Beside him stood a woman who appeared to be his divine counterpart. Calandria Monet Whitlow, formerly Calandria Dupree of Savannah, Georgia, was as revered as her husband. Raised in a quiet Pentecostal household by her grandmother, she was the product of prayer and discipline. She met Leontae in seminary school, where she was studying Christian counseling. Their courtship was fast, passionate, and deeply spiritual. They married within a year, and from that moment on, Calandria became more than a wife. She became a symbol. In the church, she was known for her elegance, always dressed in muted pastels, her hair in perfect curls, her voice as smooth as a hymn. But she wasn't just ornamental. Calandria oversaw the church's Sisters of Restoration program, a support group for battered women, single mothers, and trauma survivors. She offered late-night prayer calls, one-on-one counseling, and home visits that turned strangers into sisters. The women trusted her, loved her. She was the gentle hand behind the pulpit's fire. Together, Leontae and Calandria became what the congregation called the power couple of the pulpit. They graced magazine covers for local Christian publications. They hosted retreats in the Blue Ridge Mountains. People traveled across state lines just to glimpse them, to sit beneath their teaching, to be near what they believed was anointed love. To the outside world, they were untouchable, spiritual royalty robed in grace and glory. They smiled in sync. They prayed in harmony. And behind closed doors, they were something else entirely. Beneath the robes, behind the altar, and under the weight of 1,000 amens, Pastor Leontae Durell Whitlow was living a double life so dark it threatened to swallow everything he had built. While the congregation raised their hands in praise, Leontae was texting from a second phone, a phone no one knew about, not even Calandria. It was registered under the name L-Dub, a street-flavored pseudonym he used to arrange secret meetings in cities like Birmingham, Charlotte, Jacksonville, and Nashville. Hotel receipts, late-night drives, and cash payments told the truth he kept buried beneath the pulpit. Some of his encounters were with professional sex workers, men who asked no questions and kept their mouths shut. But not all of them. Others were younger, confused, broken men he had once counseled in his church office, who came to him for prayer and left with scars. Vulnerable souls in search of healing, only to be spiritually manipulated and emotionally seduced. What he did wasn't just infidelity. It was calculated, predatory, and masked in God's name. A pattern of abuse, hidden in Scripture and laced with charm. In early 2018, the secret began to take a deadly turn. Leontae tested positive for HIV. The clinic visit was discreet. The paperwork was real. The doctor looked him in the eye, handed him a pamphlet, and told him the next steps were critical, not just for his own health, but for the health of anyone he had touched. He was prescribed antiretroviral medication, connected with a counselor, and pleaded with to tell his wife. To be honest. To take responsibility. But Leontae didn't take the pills. He didn't change his lifestyle. He didn't confess. He drove home from the clinic in silence, parked in the church lot, and walked straight into Bible study like nothing had happened. He told one lover, a young man barely out of his teens, "God already forgave me." As if forgiveness was a get-out-of-judgment card. As if divine grace erased the danger he had now become. The lies didn't stop. If anything, they grew bolder. He kept preaching, kept laying hands on the sick, kept calling down fire from heaven. He wiped tears from broken hearts while hiding the rot in his own. He kept arranging meetups in cheap motels while kissing Calandria goodnight and praying over their meals. In the eyes of the church, he was still a prophet. But in the shadows, he was something else entirely. And all the while, Calandria had no idea. She was sleeping beside a man who carried a secret that could destroy her body and soul. It began with small things. Calandria would wake up tired, even after a full night's sleep. She blamed it on the demands of ministry, early morning prayer calls, women's retreats, constant counseling sessions. Then came the headaches, the weight loss, the strange sores in her mouth that made it hard to eat. She powered through it all with quiet dignity, refusing to let anyone see her weakness. By autumn of 2023, she was struggling to catch her breath walking from the sanctuary to her car. She saw doctors. One said it was shingles. Another diagnosed stress-induced ulcers. When a persistent cough turned into pneumonia, someone brought up tuberculosis. They ran tests, prescribed antibiotics, and sent her home with more questions than answers. No one mentioned the possibility of HIV. Why would they? Calandria was a married woman of faith, a first lady, known for her monogamy and spiritual discipline. The unthinkable didn't fit her narrative. By February of 2024, her condition nosedived. She was rushed to Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, barely able to walk, her skin ashen and her eyes hollow. A young internist, curious, careful, and not blinded by assumptions, ordered a full panel. The results came back within hours. Calandria wasn't just HIV positive. She had full-blown AIDS. Her immune system was nearly non-existent. Every breath was a battle. When they told her, she broke. Her body trembled uncontrollably as tears streamed down her face. How? She asked again and again, her voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. How is this possible? I've only ever been with one man. She wasn't just sick, she was devastated. Everything she had believed in, the man she had shared her life with, the vow she had taken before God, it all collapsed in a single diagnosis. She died 2 weeks later. Just like that. No healing revival. No prayer circle. No laying on of hands. She slipped away quietly, her body ravaged and her spirit shattered. Pastor Leontae wasted no time. He refused an autopsy, claimed it wasn't necessary, that the Lord had already received her. He pushed for immediate cremation, saying he'd received divine instruction. No funeral service. No obituary. No slideshow of memories. Just a hushed ceremony with 4 church elders, a few muted prayers, and a sealed urn no one was allowed to touch. The woman who had once been the heart of the ministry, who had given her life to the church, was gone. And just like that, the church moved on. But the silence wouldn't last. The whispers didn't die with Calandria. If anything, they grew louder, fueled by the silence that followed her sudden death. Church members had questions. Why was there no funeral? Why was her body cremated so quickly? Why did Pastor Leontae return to the pulpit as if nothing had happened? The man who once wept openly during altar calls now wore a hollow smile and kept his sermons brief. But it wasn't just the congregation that noticed something was off. A nurse from Emory University Hospital, disturbed by the rapid cremation and Leontai's refusal to approve further testing, filed a formal report with the Fulton County Health Department. She flagged the possibility of a public health violation. Around the same time, a former lover of Leontai's came forward, nervous, angry, and broken. He told me he had it. The man confessed to investigators. Said God had already healed him. Said he didn't have to tell nobody. That it wasn't lying if you had faith. That statement cracked everything open. Within days, authorities obtained a warrant. They pulled Leontai's medical history. The results were damning. He had been diagnosed with HIV in mid-2018, had received multiple prescriptions for antiretroviral therapy, and had stopped filling them after just 2 months. They accessed his phone records and digital backups. Text messages stretched back years, many to other men, many confirming his awareness of his diagnosis. I'm good. God already forgave me. Read one. Another. I walk by faith, not by sight, bro. But it didn't stop at messages. Surveillance footage began pouring in from hotels across Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. The same face, the same robes, the same routine. One clip showed him meeting up with a 21-year-old male parishioner from his own congregation, someone who later tested positive and was now cooperating with the investigation. By spring of 2024, the case had become too big to keep quiet. On the first Sunday of June, the sanctuary of Divine River Tabernacle was filled as usual. The choir was mid-song, voices raised in praise, hands clapping to the rhythm of gospel drums. Then came the silence, an eerie, foreign stillness, as U.S. Marshals walked down the aisle. Leontae had just stepped onto the stage when he saw them. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. He was handcuffed without a word, still wearing his flowing white robe and gold cross. The congregation gasped. Some cried. Others whispered prayers. A few pulled out their phones, unsure whether this was a spiritual test or a breaking point. As they led him out through the center aisle, one woman fainted. Another screamed. And just like that, the man once hailed as a prophet walked out of his pulpit, silent, shackled, and exposed. The charges against Leontae Whitlow were nothing short of harrowing. Felony murder, criminal transmission of HIV, reckless conduct, and tampering with a corpse. These were the accusations that now defined the once revered pastor. To the public, he had been a man of God, a protector of souls, and a healer who wielded his faith like a weapon. Yet, in the courtroom, the prosecution made one thing clear: Leontae Whitlow had weaponized faith, turning his sacred position into a tool of destruction. The trial, which began in early September 2024, was an emotional roller coaster. The prosecution's strategy was simple but devastating: expose the truth of Leontai's actions and show how he had used his position of power to exploit those who trusted him. They began with a series of chilling testimonies from former lovers. Each witness painted a picture of manipulation, coercion, and betrayal. Some of the men trembled as they took the stand. They spoke of how Leontae had preyed upon their vulnerabilities, how he had promised spiritual healing only to leave them with emotional scars and a deadly virus. The most powerful testimonies came from those who had been underage when Leontae first began abusing them. One man, barely in his 20s, spoke of how he had been just 16 when Leontae had initiated a sexual relationship with him, disguised as spiritual guidance. His voice cracked as he recalled how Leontae had taken advantage of his trust, making him believe that their actions were justified by faith. Another former lover spoke of being lured into Leontai's world with promises of salvation, only to be discarded once the damage had been done. But it was the testimony of Calandria's younger sister, Zakira Monet Braswell, that brought the courtroom to its knees. Zakira had always been close to her sister, and losing her had been a devastating blow. Now, as she stood before the court, The weight of her grief was palpable. Her hands trembled as she held up her phone, reading Calandria's final text message through tears. "I can't breathe. I don't understand why my body is dying. I don't understand why God is silent. I never cheated." The words hung in the air like a haunting refrain. For Zakira, it was the moment she realized just how much her sister had suffered in silence. The entire courtroom fell silent as she spoke, the raw pain of her words cutting through the tension. Calandria, the woman who had once been the church's beacon of hope and grace, had been taken from this world by a man who had sworn to protect her. Zakira's voice trembled as she finished reading the text, her sobs echoing in the courtroom. The jury looked on, many of them wiping away tears. The emotional weight of the trial had reached its breaking point. The defense team attempted to discredit the testimonies, claiming that the accusations against Leontae were exaggerated or misinterpreted. But no argument could diminish the impact of the victims' voices or the undeniable truth of Leontai's actions. As the trial progressed, the defense offered little more than character references from former parishioners who still believed in Leontai's divine calling. These supporters spoke of the miracles they had witnessed and the lives Leontae had supposedly changed for the better. But these testimonies were nothing more than a desperate attempt to salvage the reputation of a man who had long since abandoned any moral compass. On October 21, 2024, after a tense 4-hour deliberation, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom was filled with a mix of relief, anger, and sorrow. Leontae Whitlow, once seen as a pillar of faith, was now a convicted criminal. The sentencing was swift. Leontae was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected the severity of his crimes. In addition to his life sentence, he was ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution to the families of his known victims. The restitution was a small comfort to those whose lives had been shattered by Leontai's betrayal, but it would never erase the trauma he had inflicted. As Leontae was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he held his head high, his face unreadable. His supporters, who had gathered outside, shouted words of encouragement, but their voices were drowned out by the jeers and cries of those who had been harmed by his actions. The once revered pastor was now a man without a future, a fallen shepherd who had destroyed countless lives in his wake. For the victims, the trial was only the beginning of a long road to healing. But for those who had suffered in silence for so long, the conviction of Leontae Whitlow was a bittersweet victory, a step toward justice, but one that could never undo the pain he had caused. The truth had been revealed, but the scars would remain. Within 2 weeks of the verdict, Divine River Tabernacle was no more. The towering sanctuary that once echoed with praise and worship fell silent. Parishioners stopped coming. The doors were padlocked. Sermon videos vanished from the internet, and the church's website returned a blank screen. What had once been a bustling house of faith transformed into an abandoned shell, a monument to betrayal. The same pulpit where Leontae Whitlow once shouted declarations of salvation now stood empty, haunted by the silence of unanswered questions and broken trust. The destruction didn't stop at the church walls. Families were torn apart, friendships splintered. Some longtime members clung desperately to denial, insisting Leontae had been framed, a casualty of an anti-Christian agenda. Others, however, were gutted by the realization that they had worshipped under a man who had exploited their devotion for nearly a decade. Mothers who once brought their sons to counseling sessions with Pastor Leontae now lay awake at night, haunted by the possibilities. A generation of spiritual trust had been burnt to ash. Zakira Monet Braswell, still grieving the loss of her sister, made one final request: to give Calandria the dignity she had been denied in death. After legal back and forth, the urn containing Calandria's ashes was recovered from the church elders. With trembling hands and a heart full of sorrow, Zakira buried her sister in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Macon. There was no choir, no congregation, no televangelist eulogy. Just a gray stone marked with a simple truth: she believed in love. She died in truth. It was a solemn act of reclamation, a way to free Calandria from the lies that suffocated her in life and stole her in death. In the broader community, the ripples of the scandal spread like oil on water. News crews packed up. Hashtags trended for a few weeks before fading. But among those who had called Divine River home, the fallout lingered. Some tried to move on quietly, avoiding eye contact at grocery stores. Others gathered in support groups, struggling to rebuild a faith that no longer felt safe. There were angry voices, 2 accusations hurled at the health department, the church board, even God. Why hadn't anyone stopped him sooner? Why didn't anyone listen when rumors first stirred? Why did it take a death? In the end, there were no easy answers. Just the hollow echo of a pulpit that once promised salvation and instead delivered silence, suffering, and secrets. The legacy of Leontae Whitlow wasn't just the crimes he committed, but the sacred trust he shattered, one soul, one sermon, one lie at a time. This wasn't just a tragedy of deceit. It was a calculated betrayal cloaked in Scripture. It was the slow, deliberate unraveling of a life wrapped in faith, love, and trust. Calandria Monet Whitlow didn't just die from a virus. She died from silence. From the cowardice of a man who stood behind a pulpit preaching salvation while spreading destruction. From a system that exalted charisma over character. From a congregation too mesmerized to question the man they called anointed. Leontae Whitlow's story is not rare. It's just rarely told. In churches across the country, power often shields the pulpit, and image drowns integrity. People assume holiness where there is only performance. Titles replace accountability. And behind the curtain, unchecked ego spiral before it reached her hospital bed? How many others sat in silence, too afraid or too broken to speak up? And more than that, how do we, as communities, as congregants, as people, hold spiritual leaders accountable when their power protects them from truth? There are no easy answers, but silence can no longer be one of them. If this story stunned you, if it made you question, made you ache, made you furious, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because we don't just tell stories. We expose the darkest intersections of faith, love, and betrayal, where the masks fall and the truth finally rises.